Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Morgan Lewin. I'm one of the moderators of our Ask Historians, writing under the username A_Quatermain. And joining me today is Ivan, one of our flares. Welcome, Ivan. It's very nice to have you with us again. So today we are going to be talking about something very interesting that pertains to the First World War, but not necessarily from the historical perspective, but from the perspective of how the beginnings and the very early developments in this particular conflict are taught in different levels of education through textbooks. So, Ivan, what can you tell us about these textbooks that you've been analyzing?
So, firstly, a massive thank you once again to the Ask Historians for facilitating this great podcast episode. And indeed, let's get straight into it. So, I've been looking mainly at three textbooks in particular, and these textbooks are still currently within use today, and they're mainly used either for international high school curricula, such as the IGCSEs or the A levels, even the International Baccalaureate or IB, all the way up until early undergraduate studies in history, and especially within the historical topic of the First World War. And what I'm doing with all these textbooks is using them as a sort of comparison to see how the First World War's origins are taught at different levels of school, how the pedagogy has evolved to keep up to, or even how it hasn't quite reflected the current state of historiographical academia, and also what can be done from a perspective of someone who studied the historiography to better the way in which teachers and teaching material is created for the origins of World War One. That's basically what I'm going to be talking about today.
Okay, so one of the first things that comes to mind is so we're talking about very specific textbooks that tend to be used for a very specific sort of curriculum because international pedagogy and international baccalaureates and that kind of formation is very specific. It's usually not particularly defined by even by the region or the particular country in which a student is based. There's like a very specific set of standards and rules for these sort of education programs because to put it bluntly, it tends to be very difficult programs. They are certainly not your traditional run-of-the-mill high school or secondary school educations. So I think that my first question about this would be why were you particularly interested in this specific set of curriculums instead of, for example, how it's seen or how it's perceived or how it's taught in just traditional secondary or middle school educations in different parts of the world?
So that's a very interesting question, and I think the first thing that I need to make clear now is my own personal connection to these high school curricula. I am a very recent graduate of a high school that had one of these curricula as its main curriculum. I recently graduated from a school that had the International Baccalaureate, and so in the diploma program within the history subject, we learn a lot about the First World War, and I've also had very close ties with people who've done A levels and IGCSEs, and they also learn about the First World War specifically within different within dedicated units there as well. And what's interesting here is that when I'm talking to these fellow peers of mine and comparing how they learned about the First World War compared to how other national curriculums or region-specific curriculums treat the First World War, what's immediately apparent is just how individualized, I suppose would be a good word, the First World War is treated, in the sense that when it comes to regional curriculums, of course, this isn't an umbrella statement, but within the examples that I looked at, for example, within the American school curriculums or perhaps within British school curriculums, which do follow similar guidelines to the international school ones, but not quite as high or indeed as difficult as you mentioned, there's a tendency to place the First World War as a sort of subset within a period of the nation's history. So, for example, American high school students are more likely to look at the First World War with regards to 1917 and America's entry to the war, and that is then seen as a smaller sort of stepping stone to the origins of the Second World War, which of course America was much more heavily involved in, or at least chronologically, spent more time fighting than the First World War. And it's the same within Britain as well, where the First World War is definitely treated with a lot more respect, given its national memory memory. It's placed within the national memory of Britain. But at the same time, it's again also seen as a subset of how Britain fared in the 20th century with two world wars, decolonization, the end of the empire, and such. And these are very specific ways to study the First World War. There's nothing wrong with them, certainly, but the reason why I mainly looked at international curriculums like the IB and IGCSE and so on is that they are free from this sort of restriction of looking at it as a part of national history, or indeed as a sort of epoch that's a subset of the epoch of the 20th century. They see the First World War as a separate event worthy of being studied in its own unit or in its own time frame. And it's separate, but certainly not independent of other units. The First World War, indeed, is very crucial to understanding why the Second World War occurred, especially with the interwar years. So I think that sort of is why I decided to look at international curriculum. The fact that they are able to isolate the First World War from other sort of topics within the histories of otherwise nations or regions, and also that allows them a lot more freedom subsequently, or so it's believed, within the pedagogy and within the teaching and the materials that can be used for those units.
I think that that's a very interesting perspective because it's very true. In the countries that have had a very specific relationship to this particular conflict, the same happens with the Second World War and even with the Cold War. There tends to be I mean, humanity is a very one-sided uh, entity. We are not very good at impartiality or objectivity, but there are certainly different levels of it, especially when you're talking about teaching and designing the didactic and pedagogical materials. And I think that this is a very interesting approach. So, since you look at three different textbooks, why don't you tell us a little bit about each of them, and then we can talk about the differences. But I first want to know, and I want our audience, of course, to know about the specifics of each of these three different
Yep.
materials.
So the first textbook was the Lancaster Pamphlets, third edition, The Origins of the First World War by Ruth Hennig. This edition was published in 2002, and this one is specifically used for A levels, and the foreword specifically mentions that it's meant to be used for those preparing for the examinations at the A levels, and that is the age range of about 15 to 17, if not mistaken, or about late middle school, early high school, for those wondering. And then this textbook is certainly, I would say, the simplest of the three that I looked at, in that it does not overcomplicate matters. And I can certainly see the role of this textbook to be one that teachers would make copies of specific pages, specific chapters, for example, and give them out to students as handouts to read or to study in class or outside of class. And it is useful in that regard. It has been geared towards it. The explanations are short. There is a glossary at the beginning and maps and pictures all throughout. And there's even a dedicated section at the end of sources and primary and secondary sources, which are relevant to explaining, or at least so the textbook says, relevant to explaining the origins of the First World War. But there's a glaring issue within this textbook, and it's one that is definitely not reflective of how current academia has treated the origins of the First World War. And that is that this textbook is dominated by the narrative of a single country, and that country is, rather unsurprisingly, Germany. Imperial Germany is the main country through which Hennig's textbook traverses the origins of the First World War. It covers the period from Bismarck's dismissal in 1890 all the way up to the German decision for war in 1914. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the textbook ignores the other countries. Of course not. But as a result of its Germanic focus, if you will, it it places the other countries in sort of secondary positions, and it immediately lowers the agency that these countries otherwise actually possessed in the lead up to the war. The actions of the leaders of these countries, Britain, France, Russia, Austria Hungary, and Serbia even, are portrayed as corollary or secondary in importance to the German decisions and the German actions in the lead up to 1914. And that's very dangerous because that implies, at least to the critical reader, that above and beyond the consideration of all other decisions taken by all the great powers and not so great powers of 1914, Germany's decisions were the ones that caused the war and propelled it into war. Now, of course, this is very dangerous because it leads directly to the unspoken conclusion, which students are supposedly supposed to pick up for themselves, that Germany was responsible for the First World War. And this idea of war guilt is certainly one that the textbooks that I've read sort of shy away from. I think Hennig's work is the one that does it the most blatantly, in that it implies it so directly that Germany was the nation that caused the First World War. This is very much not what the current historical academia says. The current historiography has shied away from the idea of war guilt and pointing a blaming finger at any one person, party, or nation in the events of July 1914. Instead, because of the distance to the First World War, historians are now inclined to view the events through a sort of disinterested but critical and sometimes sympathetic lens. And this is very much not what Hennig's work is doing. It's investing itself within the German narrative and the sort of German war guilt narrative that wouldn't have been so out of place in the 1960s with Fisher's theses coming to light, but it's definitely out of place for the 2010s and 2020s, obviously, with the shying away from pointing at a single country as the perpetrator of the First World War.
So that's very interesting because yes, like you very well explained. Nowadays, we certainly moved on from the idea that Germany was entirely to blame or solely to blame, because we've moved on from the idea of blame at all at this point. We don't, and we no longer understand the vicissitudes and the complexities of the entire geopolitical scene that led to the First World War, or to any war in human history, to be honest, in terms of guilt or in terms of blame. But I do find it interesting because this particular tendency towards shifting a certain understanding of the balance of power in favor of Germany is definitely very much aligned with what used to be a very prevalent historiographical current in Great Britain, particularly, where for decades during the 20th century, many historians and most of the population actually ended up blaming the entirety of the war on Germany and the German Empire. I mean, the royal house of Great Britain had to change their names to avoid sounding German. So I do find it very interesting that, even though I'm not necessarily saying that there is a correlation, but this idea and this notion that Germany was solely to blame is definitely not something new, and it's definitely not something that has just randomly come out of the woodwork.
Yeah, so the idea of Germany being to blame for those war, as you mentioned, is certainly it was the dominant historiographical thesis immediately after the war. But even within the post-war era, it was actually interesting to note that British historians were in agreement with their German and American compatriots in laying down the framework of what we would call the revisionist historiography of the origins of the First World War. Now, with the Treaty of Versailles having been laid in ink and the interwar years influencing the writing of historians, there's a shift in the current of historiography, and now it's moving away from pointing a blaming finger at Germany. Certainly, it's still the dominant belief, but there are those who are now arguing and writing that Germany is not the only country to blame for the First World War. You have to look at the fact that Austria-Hungary and Serbia were the first two nations to go to war in 1914. Then you have to consider that Russia also went to war shortly after that and was very aggressive against Vienna and in support of Belgrade. And then, of course, you have France, and then, of course, Britain as well. And so you have this immediate problem faced by the historians, with the First World War's memory still fresh in the minds of everyone, not just the soldiers and the politicians, but also the civilians who experienced it. How are you supposed to blame a country for starting such a massive, devastating conflict, the worst that Europe has seen for almost 100 years, and then expect them to live with that for the rest of their existence, for the rest of their lives. And this sort of and so historians solve this problem by shifting the blame away from the personal decisions and actions of figures during 1914 and governments during 1914, and instead onto the uncomplaining shoulders of what we sort of might term the impersonal forces or the big forces, which they believe started the First World War. And some of these include social Darwinism, imperialism, the need for greater economic power, the sort of natural order of war and how it was needed to refresh the order of Europe. And all these sorts of mass demand forces were very common within the historiography during the 1920s and 1930s. And very much even after the Second World War, they were still being argued for, even with Fisher's controversy over German war guilt and the reignition of the debate over the First World War's origins. So, this is again something that I doubt we'll ever find an answer to in the next 100 years or so. You could have the same podcast, and no one would be able to tell you who started World War One. And I think the important thing to note here is that teaching the First World War's origin should reflect that, right? Students shouldn't be asked to point a blaming finger at who started the First World War. That's just not reflective of the academic historiography. Yes, there were countries and figures who can be blamed more so than others, but that doesn't mean that you can then lay the guilt of starting the First World War, the Great War, if you will, on the shoulders of that nation, even if we are 100 years or 100 plus years beyond the events of the July crisis of 1914. So this is something that Henig's book actually does fairly well with, and that all the textbooks do very, very well with, is that they stray away from this idea of the big forces, the impersonal forces, dragging Europe into war. And I'll link back to this later on. But this idea of sort of inadvertent war, one that no one could control, one that no one understood, is very much pretty much discredited in the current historiography, with the shift starting in the 1980s and 90s. This was very much a conscious war. Europe's leaders knew and expressed throughout the July crisis what they were getting into. They very much knew that war was an option, and not just the sort of localized Austro-Hungarian Serbian war, but a continental war was very much one that they knew would happen if they took certain parts and if they enacted certain policies during the July crisis. So all these textbooks that I've looked at, Henig's and the ones I'll present about later on, they stray away from this, and that's very reflective. I think I didn't quite benefit from this in my high school education. As an aside, I was always informed. I was given the sort of main acronym, which I've written about before on Ask Historians, as not great for explaining the origins of the First World War. But I think it's definitely great that we're shying away, we're shifting away decisively in teaching and pedagogy from depicting the First World War as sort of inevitable and down to impersonal, larger, darker forces that none of the statesmen or diplomats of Europe could control.
I think that that's a great way of putting it. I remember many years ago, back when I studied international relations, one of my professors in a very specific class that pertained to the study of treaties and international agreements and accords was talking about the First World War, and I remember she said that the First World War was a diplomatic war before anything else. And that definition always sticked with me, because it's basically what you've been saying. I mean, it's not a war that was caused by outside forces. It's not a war that was entirely and absolutely inevitable. It was decided upon. It was there were decisions made that were acted on, and I think that that's a very important thing to understand. So I like the fact that you're mentioning that even despite your own disagreements with these textbooks, you do consider that they still adhere to this idea of, okay, we need to understand and we need to look at this particular conflict as an entirely avoidable conflict. And so, what's our second textbook like?
Great. So our second textbook is the Seminar Studies in History by Gordon Martell. This is the fourth edition, published in 2017. This one is not quite made for any specific international curriculum, but it could definitely be adapted to any of them. It's sort of a general information textbook that teachers might pick up and again copy extracts of for students to read and study and discuss within class or outside of class. And this textbook is definitely much bigger than Henig's. Henig's is about half the size, half the length, sorry, of this one. And this textbook is moving in the right direction. It's for definitely higher level students. It would be for definitely early to late mid to late high school, possibly even very early undergraduate studies, but not quite staying for the whole undergraduate studies. And this textbook is a step in the right direction, in my opinion, in several ways. So, as you mentioned, firstly, and as we discussed, it portrays the war as an entirely avoidable one. It doesn't resort to the use of impersonal forces and all those words that usually get tossed about when we hear about the origins of the First World War: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and so forth. But what it is also doing that's better than Henig's is that it is moving away from a single nation dominated narrative. There no longer are the chapters and sub chapters concerned about Germany or indeed about any other nation during the First World War, but instead it looks at specific events and developments within Europe diplomatically, politically, and geopolitically, obviously, in the lead up to 1914. It goes about as far back as the 1870s with the creation of the German Empire after the Franco-Prussian War, and even touches a little bit on that before with a brief backstory on the Napoleonic Wars ending and the sort of concert of Europe system which prevailed. But after that, it focuses a lot on the international alliance, sorry, the continental alliances and the development of the diplomatic ties between each nation and all of the leaders. But what it also struggles with is this idea that the First World War was enacted and war was declared by a nation. You hear the terms Britain declared war, Germany had to support Austria Hungary, Austria Hungary had to act against Serbia, Russia had to protect the Slavs. But these are very common catch alls in historiography. Who are we referring to when we talk about a nation in this case? Do we refer to, there's no way we can refer to all the inhabitants of those nations in 1914. It's simply impossible. Do we refer even to groups of people, perhaps the upper classes, the ruling classes, or do we refer to the working classes, which for quite some time had the unsavory position of being burdened with the fact that they apparently dragged the higher classes into war? That's just false, but that's an aside. So, what this book is lacking, and what this textbook is lacking, is emphasizing the role of individuals. Now, of course, again, a warning here: if we overemphasize the role of individuals, we're leaning into great man theory or great, not so great man theory, right? And unfortunately, yes, or perhaps fortunately, yes, all the decision makers of 1914 were men, and there have been arguments that their male attitudes created the need for war, but that's beside the point as well. The problem with this textbook mainly stems from that lack of focus in identifying who were the key decision makers of 1914 and what were their roles in the lead up to the crises. We are currently, even within works of pop history in the past 10 or so years, we're seeing a massive shift away from the larger collective representations of nations and towards more specific analyses or narratives which focus on individuals and their impact, be they the statesmen, the diplomats, or even the to be successful or failed assassins of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We're looking at who these people were, what their roles were, what actions and developments they contributed to, firstly, and of course, why they enacted these actions or made these decisions, and overall what their role in the larger picture of 1914 was. And I think Martel does a decent job of this. He does list a lot of key figures at the beginning of his book, but they're then not so much analyzed. They're just sort of name dropped everywhere that you can see them, and it just sort of ends up reading like a who done it, right? Tsar Nicholas II thought this, Sazonov thought this, Kaiser Wilhelm thought this, etc., etc., etc. And that's certainly acceptable for teaching, especially at a middle school level or even a low high school level, because of course to suggest that you can teach the origins of the First World War in the way the historiography teaches it is ludicrous. You have to simplify some things. You just have to. It's the nature of pedagogy and the nature of teaching history. But at the same time, what this does is that it betrays a sense of collective responsibility for all these actions. When we refer to Britain signing the Entente Cordiale with France, or Germany issuing the blank check to Austria-Hungary, who are we actually referring to in these cases? The way that this textbook lays it out, and indeed in the same way that Hennig's textbook lays it out, is that this was a sort of national effort, that the entire government approved this. That's not true. There were key coteries of decision makers who held the strings of power in 1914, who had their own constitutional or unwritten roles, duties, and of course they had their own mentality, to borrow a word from historiography. They had their own thoughts, fears, assumptions, and doubts, spoken or unspoken about, that need to be analyzed, and they are analyzed in the current historiography. So I think a bit more focus on who these decision makers are, what their roles are, and what their own, what the whole concept of agency with these key figures is very important to instill within teaching materials for the origins of World War One. Certainly, of course, not to the extent that it goes super in depth with each one like the historiography does, but certainly to a surface level, right? If it would be great if before each chapter we understand who's who. Don't just name them. Tell the students who they are, what their background is, what else have they contributed to in the lead up to digital crisis, what's their government position at this exact time, and therefore what are their responsibilities. That can be done in bullet points. It does not need to be a long drawn out essay, of course, but it is important information that I think should definitely be integrated in some way into any future textbook on the First World War.
I like this idea of trying to differentiate between great men theory and the necessity to actually name names, because sometimes you have to name names. None of us these days, or at the very least most of us in the historical community these days, we don't really like great man theory anymore. But it is important to understand that sometimes there are certain individuals, specifically as you were mentioning, in cases where we are so close to the 19th century mentality, in which men were very much decision makers, where you have to name them. But I think it's an interesting idea, particularly when it comes to teaching on an international level, but also even in a regional level. This concept of, okay, we need to define and we need to understand who these people actually were, what they did, what their positions were, because specifically and particularly for those of us who don't actually come from Europe and who don't have any sort of relationship with what a monarchical state even looks like or looked like at any time in history, because those of us who lived in former colonies, we might understand the concept generally of what a monarchy used to be at the time we were colonized, like the Spanish colonies in South America where I live. But this idea of looking at the Europe of 1914, in which the very concept of monarchy isn't a single universal concept, is something that needs to be looked at, because when you look at Kaiser Wilhelm, you don't see in the Kaiser the same amount of power that the British king had, for example, even though they were both monarchs. And I think it's one of the most important things that we need to look at, is to understand just how much power some of these people had, and how much responsibilities some of these individuals used to carry during this particular period, in which absolute monarchy is still very much a thing in some countries, and it hasn't been a thing for hundreds of years in other European countries.
Yeah, so that's again something that goes perfectly with what we've been discussing here, the role of individuals. And a particular aside here, I absolutely abhor any pop history narratives or even pedagogy narratives that portray the First World War as a spat between family trees in Europe. That's ridiculous. As you mentioned, King George V had ludicrously little power if you compare him to how much power his cousin Tsar Nicholas II had, and even then, his power was not absolute. There were no dictatorships in Europe in 1914, as opposed to 1939, when we can very clearly draw to an authoritarian, totalitarian system, and that is immediately a system where we know, all right, this person had the power because they were the dictator, whether it be Hitler, Mussolini, or even Stalin to various degrees. Europe's governments in 1914 were all shades of autocracy or even a constitutional monarchy, right down to France, which didn't have a monarch and was a republic. So you have these different government systems, and as you mentioned, it's important that students learn what the basics of that systems mean, right? So who is the head of each government, who's the key decision maker that we sort of have here, and something that is definitely stressed more often and analyzed is who actually had the ability to declare war, right? When we say Germany declared war, we don't actually say that. We say Kaiser Wilhelm II signed the declaration of war against France and Russia. But that's very boring to say and very long, so we can just simplify it to say Germany declared war. But that's misleading as well, right? Because there is always opposition. There was fervent opposition in Britain, in France, in Russia, and even in Germany and Austria Hungary, right up until the end of the July crisis for a war. This was not a unanimous decision, and that's something that textbooks need to stress. Whose voices really mattered in the events of 1914? Whose impacted the outlook and the policy and the decisions that each nation took in response to the developments that happened within other nations and other governments as well? Because because textbooks and the historiography have certainly moved away from portraying the First World War as a sort of dominoes falling, chain of dominoes falling, where event A occurs, for example, the assassination, and then event B occurs immediately after, the Austrian declaration to Serbia, or perhaps the Austro-Hungarian, the blank check issued by Germany to Austria-Hungary. This is very much not the case. This wasn't how it happened. These were overlapping decisions, discussions, and meetings happening at the same time. These decision makers had to adapt or failed to adapt to new information coming in. A particular sort of academic overkill, if you will, within historiography is looking at the events of July 1914 hour by hour, day by day. What happened in each capital, what happened with regards to the decision for war or against war, and what information was being received or dispatched or leaked, even that influenced the decision makers or failed to influence them. And of course, that's something you can never compress into a single volume work of reasonable length for pedagogy at high school or middle school level, right? You wouldn't be able to do that in a million years because there's just so much that you need to compress and fit in. But you can certainly give a sense, you can certainly attempt to help students remember that this isn't just a series of events happening one after the other. They are all interlocking, they're all overlapping, and they're dependent on not just other events happening, but also other factors such as the fears, the rising fears, the tensions, the doubts, and the worries of all the statesmen involved. And I think, as well, linking back to what the question was, or at least what the discussion point was, we also have to consider what the role of the monarchs was, because the monarchs were not negligible, right? We can't say that any of them didn't play a role. They did, certainly. There's been so much written about Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II, and particularly the latter, about their role in the July crisis. But we also have to understand what they wanted, what they didn't want, and who were their key advisors, who held them back, who managed to convince them for war or against war, and how did they themselves factor into the larger decision making body and processes which led to the declaration of war by their countries, and of course their entry into what would become the worst conflict in Europe since possibly the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimean Wars. So that's very interesting. It's very interesting to talk about, but it's also almost essential to at least try and impart an essence of to students as well.
I absolutely agree. And okay, and let's look at in the time we have left. Let's look at our third and final textbook.
Yep. So the third and final textbook is a very big one. It is The Origins of World War One by Richard Hamilton and Holger Herweg. But basically, this textbook is what you would see in a undergraduate level. This is not for high school, very much not for high school. And the reason for that is that this is not so much a textbook as a collection of essays written by very notable historians of the late 1990s and early 2000s in First World War academia about the origins of the First World War and how each nation made the decision for war. So there were specific essays on all the great powers, and then there were essays on the other powers which did take part in the war, including the Ottoman Empire, Romania, Japan, the United States, and so forth. And this is, I think, I would argue this to be the sort of golden standard that reflects the massive shift in historiography towards the diplomatic and geopolitical history, and also towards the IR history of the First World War, focusing on the key figures, defining their roles, understanding or attempting to understand their mentality, and of course, giving backstory and context to the mood in the capitals and decision making bodies of these nations prior to the events of July 1914. And each essay is not long. The longest essay is only about 40 pages or so. Most are much smaller, but they're all very succinct in the sense that they immediately lay out a key structure, which is number one, identifying the decision making bodies and the individuals. Number two, analyzing them and understanding how each person was feeling during the July crisis, what their thoughts with regards to developments were, and what their roles ultimately were. And number three, also including the consideration of larger forces, particularly the public's opinion of war or the what they believed should be done in response to the crises, the voices of the large businesses, and of course the different political parties within the various countries. And this is almost perfectly a reflection of what the current historiography is like. It's based on decision making, and it always stresses the idea of contingency. There were always choices. At no point during the July crisis, until the first shots were fired by each nation, was war inevitable. And this book does a very good job of imparting that to the reader. And this is certainly something that could be better integrated into Hennig's work, certainly, and also Martel's to an extent, that there were always choices to avoid war. But this book also, at the same time, doesn't lean too much into the older historiographical norm of accusing a country of starting the First World War. Particularly in the case of Germany, the essay on Germany is very, very illuminating because it reveals that far, far from having a unified desire for war and the desire to establish a Germanic Mitteleuropa or a world order, as Fritz Fischer believed in the 1960s. The German decision making during the July crisis was a mess of about turns, confusion, and complete and utter chaos right up until the moment, and even for the few hours afterwards, in which war was declared against Russia and France, and the troops were mobilized and the famous Schlieffen Plan enacted. And this applies to all the nations. It reveals how there were times when war seemed a distant and unlikely possibility of the July crisis, and that peace could have been salvaged from the ever spiraling situation. And why it didn't is analyzed in depth. It's not just taken for granted that statesmen lost control of the situation. And this is something that I also want to talk about here. I mentioned the Inadvertent War Thesis at the beginning of this podcast episode. This was the major thesis that A.J.P. Taylor famously wrote about in his work War by Timetable, and that others followed as well. It basically posits that at the critical moments of the July crisis, in the lead up to war, the statesmen, the civilian statesmen of Europe, lost control of the decision making process and capitulated to the generals, the military staffs, the generals, the chiefs of staff, what have yous. The military was apparently the ones who enacted the decision for war, who pushed for war, and finally got what they wanted. Far from it. That's a very popular theory because it again does a great job of averting the whole idea of putting the blame on some country or some decision makers' shoulders. In fact, ironically, some of the first people to make this inadvertent war thesis and to put the blame on the generals and the military staffs were the civilian statesmen themselves, who were coordinating or not coordinating with these military staffs during 1914, and that influenced the writings of historians right up until the post-Cold War era in the 1990s, when this was debunked. Um, Now we know, and this book does a very good job of telling us, that these military figures did not have the power in 1914 to declare war. Certainly, they were the voices of war. Many of them were the war hawks in the various capitals. But at no point in any of the capitals did the civilian statesmen capitulate control of the policy making and decision making to the hands of the military. There's a very famous episode about the First World War, and a sort of an anecdote that on the evening of August the 1st, if I'm not mistaken, there's a frantic meeting in the German decision-making body about a recent telegram from Britain, or supposed telegram from Britain, which states that if German troops do not cross into France and they do not invade Belgium, then Britain will guarantee French neutrality. Now, at this time, the Schlieffen Plan has been activated. The entire German army has been mobilized for the quick defeat of France through Belgium and Luxembourg, and then turning east to face Russia. And in this scramble to respond to this telegram, the Kaiser himself, against the wishes and against the protests of his chief of staff, von Moltke the Younger, picks up the telephone and orders that the 16th Division not cross into Luxembourg until further orders are given. Of course, he's a little late, but then another contingent comes and tells the 16th Division to stop their advance and go back into German territory. And Moltke has a nervous breakdown at this point. This is a very illustrative episode because in previous tellings of it, for some curious reason, it's portrayed as Moltke convincing the Kaiser that the plan has been enacted and cannot be stopped, and then the Kaiser simply goes along with it and accepts it and goes to bed idyllically. It really wasn't like that. We have first-hand accounts of those who were in the room at the time to state that the Kaiser himself went against Moltke's protests, and when Moltke complained to the Kaiser about the fact that they needed the railway lines in Luxembourg to stage a successful invasion of France, and that there would be chaos if they didn't use those lines, the Kaiser famously turned around and shouted to Moltke, "Use other lines." And Moltke just breaks down at that point. It's a great anecdote, and it also has been analyzed, of course, historiographically, as to how this inadvertent war thesis falls apart when you look at the minutiae of decision making up until the last minute when war was inevitable. I say it with air quotes. So these are all very important things, and I think the book by Hamilton and Herwig and the various other contributors to it is an excellent read. I would side recommend it for anyone looking to get into the origins of the First World War from a more serious academic standpoint. But on the other hand, it's also a good model for possible textbook publishers or writers to follow in future editions or in future textbooks as well, for any curricula, really, arguably.
Well, I think that it's a very useful thing to have this sort of book that, as you were saying, is usually meant for an undergrad sort of public, an audience. Primarily because in the process of creating these textbooks, specifically textbooks for middle and secondary education in general, uh, the traditional process, which is in pedagogical theory is usually called didactic transposition, uh, essentially entails that you are going to have to take a scientifically designed text, and you are definitely going to have to reduce it to something that can be understood by someone who doesn't have the academic background to properly understand something that has been created in a scientific environment. And I think that these sort of compilations of different essays written by historians or written by scientists or academics of any field, not just history, but that are specifically written as essays and not as a gigantic entire book, are definitely one of the most important and one of the most useful tools when it comes to creating and developing other textbooks like the first two that you were mentioning. So I really like this idea and this concept of this third book being a role model for creating and for maybe aiding in the development of more comprehensive and specifically and particularly more critically readable textbooks, because one of the main things that these sort of programs, these international middle and secondary school programs tend to have is an emphasis and a focus on enhancing the critical capabilities of the readers, of their students. But oftentimes that's not what the textbooks end up doing. It's usually the case in textbooks that when you have, for example, the first one you were mentioning that has very short yes, well, very abridged explanations for each different topic, which can be useful. It can certainly be useful. But if you are preparing your students for uh, um, for a career in higher education in the humanities, that's actually usually counterproductive, because when you reach undergrad level, you realize that you're going to have to read texts that were not meant for you, that were not written for you to read, which is a reality that some people tend to have a very difficult time dealing with. So I think that having these sort of compilation books with different essays by different academics that may be not necessarily easy to read, but probably definitely easier to read than something you would read when you're doing a master's thesis, for example, let alone a PhD. Uh, I think that they're very deeply useful tools for generally for teachers and educators everywhere.
Yeah. So, yeah, what you mentioned about the idea of didactic transposition is very relevant to what we're discussing uh, here in this podcast. And I think it's also interesting and certainly, of course, valid that you have to abridge some version of the narrative. You have to cut it short somewhere. You have to simplify it because, of course, as you mentioned, while you're trying to teach these students how to think critically and impart the skills that they need for a good degree in the humanities and specifically in history, you're not also making it ridiculously hard for them and asking them to read what you might see on an undergraduate course or even a master's course, of course, with multi-volume works, because there are thousands of those on the First World War. But I think at the same time, these books are sort of, at least the first two books, are being a bit, for lack of a better word, tokenistic with that idea of giving practice to the students' critical skills. Because, as you mentioned, the one by Hennig is particularly short, but at the same time, it also includes a selection of primary and secondary sources at the end, which are very useful. One of the first skills that students are taught within the humanities, and especially within history, is the idea of an analyzing sources and understanding what on earth a primary, secondary, or tertiary source is, understanding bias, analyzing it, identifying bias, and ultimately gleaning the message or the idea from any sort of source that they might encounter in their studies. And within the First World War, this is a sort of, so I don't want to say sin, but it's a sort of mistake that some textbooks get into, is this idea that they merely provide the sources without giving any sort of background activities or even context to why on earth they're included in the textbook. Because Hennig's work makes reference to all of the sources that it includes at the end, but then when it gives those sources, it doesn't include anything else. Some of the better textbooks I've read actually have activities with each source where students are forced to read it and understand the development that occurred, or what the source represents within the chronology and the time frame of the chapter, perhaps, or indeed what the biases might be. That, of course, isn't present in the one by Hamilton and Herwig, but that's expected because it's a sort of essays. It's not meant to be pedagogy material quite for middle school or high school students. By the time you read this book, you're expected to already have at least a firm grasp of source reading and analysis, because, of course, you're not only meant to critically look at the sources they provide, but also view the book itself as a source and then critique it while you're reading it. So that's, of course, an advanced skill. You would never expect middle school or high school students to quite be able to do that. Of course, some of them might. Of course, the ones that are more capable and exceptional will probably be able to do that. But from the viewpoint of a curriculum, that's not quite something you want to push just yet. That's something you can develop at the very end, before exams, or if they choose to pursue it in tertiary education. But I think, again, what you mentioned is a very much true. This idea that using a collection of essays by historians actually writing about the topic, be it the origins of the First World War or any other historical topic, is a good starting point for those who are going to produce the materials needed to teach secondary students about history and about the topics that they're going to be studying in their curriculum. I remember my history teacher in high school for the IB was very good at this. He would give us essays and journal articles by historians about the Cold War, or Mussolini's Italy, or Hitler's Germany, and he would ask us to analyze them and tell us what A, the source is telling us, and B, what are the possible biases and flaws within it as a source. What's it omitting? What's it focusing on? What tone does it have? And so on and so forth. But he didn't simply chunk a whole multi-volume work, such as like Richard Evans' work on Nazi Germany, on our desk and say, "Here, read this, and you'll be fine." He guided us through understanding secondary literature, primary source work, and even tertiary pop history narratives on all the topics that we were learning about. I think that's something that has to be said, that's good about all of these works, all of these textbooks, for all their shortcomings or lack thereof, with regards to reflecting the historiography of the First World War. They all do an excellent job of combining sources and telling a narrative. But beyond anything else, a good or the very basic history textbook needs to tell a narrative, because you're trying to engage students who are probably teenagers in history, and it can get very boring if all you do is paste a bunch of facts, dates, and names down in one place. You have to tell a sort of story, right? And again, how you tell that story is going to be obviously much simpler than how historians would tell that story, or how academia will portray that story. But you do have to do it. And I think we're moving in the right direction here with these books, right? I have also looked at older textbooks from the 1990s. Those ones were not great. They continually kept pointing the war guilt finger at a country. They're dominated by one single nation's narrative. We're moving towards the better, more up to date historiography on the matter within pedagogy materials. And that is, of course, as I mentioned, diplomatic, political history, the developments in Europe, not oversimplifying things, but also not overcomplicating them. Identifying the key decision makers, identifying what's at stake at each point of the July crisis, and identifying ultimately what pushed each nation to declare war in 1914 and led them into the First World War. So we're moving in the right direction here, and obviously there's never going to be a point where we can, clap our hands and say, "All right, we're done. We've created the perfect textbook." That's not going to happen, because as soon as you create a textbook that is great for the current historiography, the historiography will shift to something else. Especially true for the First World War. I don't even know where we'll be with this historiography in 50, let alone 100 years' time, let alone possibly even 10 years' time. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think we're doing all right now, I think, as we are with the textbooks that I've looked at.
Yeah, one of the things that I usually like to emphasize whenever I'm the host of this podcast is the fact that when people look at history and as a discipline from the outside, people usually think of history as something as a monolith, as an unchanging monolith. And you heard it here first, folks. History is changing all the time. There is no such thing as a stable and non-dynamic day in historiography. We're always changing our minds. We're always changing our tunes. But I do think that it's important, as you were saying, to be able to create these sort of textbooks that reach, if not an ideal, at least a balanced level of didactic transposition in which you can tell this story, this narrative that you were mentioning, which is very, very important when you're teaching children and teenagers. But being rigorous and being thorough at the same time, not just ignoring important elements or oversimplifying things just because you have to tell a story. So yeah, thank you very much again for joining me. As always, it's a pleasure to be able to chat with you. This has been a very informative experience because I don't particularly look at this sort of textbooks in my work. But it is very interesting.
Yep. Thank you so much again, also for having me, and also for the experience, because it's always great for me to talk about my research in history, whether it be on Ask Historians posts or to the opportunity granted by this podcast. But also, it helps me learn as well whenever I talk about topics that I learn about in history, because of course there's the discussion element, and as you mentioned, yes, exactly, history is never in one place. There's no such thing as a dusty work of historiography. Historiography is always on the move, and our best role, as the best thing we can do as teachers of history, as those who propagate it to the public, and indeed within this case with the textbooks that we write about it, to reflect that historiography as best as we can, whilst also maintaining the essence of readability for the audience, for the younger audience, and the imparting of skills that are relevant to the historical and also humanities disciplines, which those people might then go into within the rest for their future.
I absolutely agree. And thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to everyone listening at home. And I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.